campaign to bring a challenge. But do the failings of Iraq mean we should kiss goodbye to the possibility of military action in the future? And who should have the right to sign off on Britain going to war? Here's Douglas Murray with his take of the week, which contains some flashing images.
The Chilcot Report has delivered a damning verdict on the war in Iraq, but it will have done nothing to change people's minds. If you thought that Tony Blair was a liar and a war criminal before, then you still do, and if you didn't think that, then you still don't. In any case, one failed war doesn't make all wars wrong. We have a tendency to remember only those interventions that have failed. We rightly talk about the mess that's being created in Iraq and in Libya, but very rarely talk about those interventions that have been a success. Sierra Leone, for instance, and Kosovo. It's worth remembering that the polls showed public support for Tony Blair in 2003, and that although the usual suspects are talking about this as an illegal war, the Chilcot inquiry does not come to that conclusion. In any case, whatever your views on Iraq, why should the Russians and the Chinese have the ability to veto UK decision-making through the UN? Russia and countries in the Middle East won't shy away from using military force. Do we really want to clear the stage and allow them to set the agenda? In all the recriminations and rightful regret over Iraq, it is worth remembering that Britain isn't the worst war criminal in the world. It is an outrage that people who have been the apologists for the worst regimes in the world are currently trying to portray themselves as moral heroes. Yes, I'm thinking of Jeremy Corbyn and his cronies and their dalliances with Moscow and Iran. And just when we need a strong Labour Party, the result is catastrophic. The Corbynistas need to go, but Chilcot has just pulled out everything from under the Blairite wing of the party. Instead of endlessly rowing about 2003, we need to decide what we're going to learn from it, and also to realise what a disaster it is that our foreign policy, as well as our politics as a whole, is in such utter disarray.
And from Bunker 51, paintball and Greenwich to our own little underground shelter on This Week. Douglas Murray joined us. Welcome. Michael, was the Chilcot Report worth waiting for?
I don't think it told us anything that we didn't know 13 years ago and certainly 9 years ago when the thing was set up. I think it's welcome that it doesn't pull its punches, but I think really everything was on the table a very, very long time ago.
Was it more robust, even damning than you thought it would be?
I was pleased it wasn't a whitewashed. It was a serious piece of work. His language was sort of very British, but very, very clear and incisive. And clearly, it's a very, very sad week for British foreign policy.
Is it the final nail in Tony Blair's reputation?
History will judge Tony Blair on a whole raft of things, but clearly, the chaos that is Iraq now, on any analysis, the lack of planning and the sectarian violence that we have in that country and in the region as a consequence, must mean that it was a catastrophe in that sense.
It gives no comfort, though, does it, Douglas, to those who think he's a war criminal?
No, I think there'll be those people are trying to do as much as they can with what they've got, but I think they are going to be disappointed with that, to that regard. But the people who want, Tony Blair to be tried, they will keep going. And I thought one of the saddest things, in a way, about the press conference he did was that one couldn't help thinking this was a man who sort of knew that he was going to have at least civil actions and others coming against him probably for the rest of his life.
I mean, George Galloway today on the Daily Politics said that he thought the war criminal route they couldn't pursue now, but they were going to pursue misconduct in public office, which is also a criminal offence. Do you think that could be a runner?
It could be. I mean, all of these things will be tried. It'll be as it was with Henry Kissinger, as it has been with others. There will be endless attempts, and I think there will be. Tony Blair knows that.
Now, it's said that Iraq will make it much harder to mount a military intervention. But since Iraq, we've intervened in Libya, and our planes are over the skies of Iraq and Syria.
Doing very, very limited operations in the latter case you give.
Maybe that's
and it
probably
might
right.
It might be right. It might be a consequences. I think that as a country we do have to think very seriously about whether or not it's appropriate that somebody in Tony Blair's position or David Cameron's position should also have hanging over them in perpetuity the idea of endless legal cases against them. I very much dislike it when that happens to soldiers and members of the armed forces, and I think that it basically makes our politics and our foreign policy pretty inoperable. I mean, of course, you stay within the bounds of the law. The bounds of the law on many of these things are very clear, but I think that the idea that any British Prime Minister could constantly fear every branch of international law is something that'll simply mean that sort of politicians who believe in the status quo and never doing anything are the only politicians we will ever get again.
Iraq clearly changes the mood for intervention, but it doesn't rule it out entirely, does it? I mean, we have intervened since Iraq.
Well, I think it changes it very much. And by the way, on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, one of the legacies we have from David Cameron is the idea that we now need a parliamentary vote before we take any military action, which I'm afraid, people listening to this will think I'm being completely undemocratic. But I think that is inoperable. If all our potential enemies believe that a Prime Minister has to toil day and night to try to put together a coalition in the House of Commons to support military action, we have no deterrent effect whatsoever.
Do you?
Well, I've voted against all military action since Iraq. I felt so let down by an intelligence service that was not properly scrutinised at the time. And I think it's not that you can't intervene, it's the terms. And I think the second thing is when you do intervene, you have to be prepared to be there for the long term. And there is this sort of sense that you can sort of quickly drop a few bombs and leave. And so it takes money, lots of money to be able. Look at what happened in Germany after the Second World War. A whole Marshall Plan, there for the long term. I don't see any of that in the international context.
We weren't prepared to commit for the part of Iraq we were responsible for, the greater Basra area. We were not prepared to commit either the men or the material for it.
No, and I think there is something shameful about getting involved in a situation which you're not willing to see through. By the way, we've discovered in recent weeks that the government didn't even plan for Brexit. So it's not surprising that 13 years earlier the government hadn't planned for post-operation in Iraq. Very quickly, I wanted to pick up on something David said about the intelligence. I must correct you a bit on that. To pretend that we were simply let down by our intelligence services is in part also to not understand what Chilcot says. Chilcot says, and we're all absorbing it still, it's a very long report, but that there was clearly, and people who were in your party at the time, like Jack Straw, were clearly reaching for intelligence to justify conclusions that they wanted them to come to. Now, intelligence is never a straightforward business. Nobody ever says this is a slam dunk and means it. It's always a process of adding up a set of things that are themselves half and quarter truths and trying to stick them together into a picture which may or may not reflect the reality. There is a clear sign from the Chilcot Report that Jack Straw and others were going to the intelligence community to get information they wanted from them. And so I think it's quite wrong to blame the intelligence community for that failure. That was a political failure.
But they did allow the politicians to talk about their intelligence in ways that couldn't be justified by the intelligence that they had given. The broader point, I suppose, is this. If you look back in the lead-up, in the period, in the years up to Iraq, we were probably too keen to intervene as a British government in too many areas. I mean, we started a big intervention in Afghanistan, but we hadn't finished in Iraq, was probably the climax of that. There is always a danger, though, is there not, David? The pendulum goes the other way, and we are now too reluctant to intervene when perhaps we should?
Well, we intervened in Sierra Leone, we intervened in Bosnia, we were in Afghanistan, and I think Chilcot says we were seriously stretched. And some of the complaints about weaponry and equipment is unforgivable.
Yes, that's damning.
The pendulum has clearly now swung to a place where largely in both in the US and the UK, it's fine to drop bombs, aerial bombardment and drones, but you're not going to commit troops on the ground. And there's a real question about whether you can actually do that if you need to intervene. If you need to intervene, it's got to be serious, and there's got to be a serious plan. You've got to do it for a long time.
Let me ask what the wider issue, Michael, is for foreign policy. Let me put this to you. We intervened in Iraq, we occupied Iraq, it's a mess. We intervened in Libya, we did not occupy Libya, it's a mess. We didn't intervene in Syria, we didn't occupy Syria, it's a mess. Where is the lesson on foreign policy?
Well, I think the lesson is that you can only intervene if you have the resources to do so, and I entirely take up what David and Douglas have both said, that you need to be willing to intervene for the long term. It's kind of like imperialism, actually. In the old days, we used to go into places with a view to being there 20, 30, 40 years, people making their careers there as governors and civil servants. We've lost all that mentality. I mean, it really is an extraordinary kind of revolt against our history. And we used to take a rather superior view. You know, the Americans were anti-imperialist because they didn't really understand what imperialism meant. And we had a history of imperialism, and actually we'd achieved some, you know, some benign results along the way. What Iraq needed was a thoroughgoing commitment.
Do we have any idea what Jeremy Corbyn's foreign policy is? What Theresa May's foreign policy might be?
No, and I mean, I would have thought in both parties they are shying away from this at the moment. I think they regard foreign policy as being a quagmire which is best not to get involved in. And the problem about that is, among other things, if I can say so, that events make things happen. And Iraq happened because of 9/11. There wasn't a causal link between those two events, but there was a link in that Washington decided they had the capability to go after another American enemy, and they decided that was Saddam Hussein. We don't know if